In today's episode, we sit down with Amy Tucker, a dedicated perinatal mental health coach and a postpartum doula. Amy shares her profound journey from working in the high tech industry to facing severe postpartum depression and anxiety after the first birth of her first child. Through her personal experiences, Amy found her passion for supporting other parents and co founded Life with Baby to provide crucial mental health support. Listen as Amy discusses the challenges of postpartum mental health, the importance of preparation, and her mission to ensure no parent feels alone. Hello, everyone. Today we have Amy with us. Amy, could you please briefly introduce yourself and also your journey into becoming a mental health coach and a doula?
Yes, absolutely. I'm really excited to be here. And first of all, thank you. Thank you for having me on your podcast and for all the work that you're doing to help increase awareness and these discussions around perinatal mental health. My name is Amy Tucker. I'm based in Austin, Texas, in the States. And I'm a certified perinatal mental health coach and a postpartum doula. And I specialize in helping parents that are struggling with perinatal mental health disorders. So, this includes things like depression and anxiety and OCD and post traumatic stress disorder that can happen both during pregnancy or postpartum. And I also work a lot with parents that are just simply finding their way emotionally while adapting to their life with the baby. And gosh, over the last 10 years, I've worked with several nonprofit organizations and various innovative startup companies to build their mental health programs. And what's most incredibly dear and close to my heart is I co founded a company called Life with Baby back in 2019 with my incredible colleague named Erin Fosnap, who is a therapist. And the company Life with Baby, we basically directly support the mental health of parents. And what we really wanted to do was create an outlet that parents could get mental health support that they need quickly and efficiently. And I'm a mom myself too. I have two kids who I absolutely love and adore. And before having my kids, I worked in the high tech industry in very stressful, very fast paced positions for 10 plus years. And it was the experience of having my two kids and overcoming such severe postpartum depression and anxiety firsthand that it really ignited my passion to change gears professionally, so to speak, and focus my time and attention to help families throughout the vulnerable perinatal time.
Great. It's such a great transition, and I would say like that's amazing decision and a really brave one. So, what would you say really impacted this decision except the kids? If it's because you just shared that you've experienced postpartum mental health issues, was that the trigger that was like, okay, I need to work for this?
100%. Yes. I think once I kind of rounded the corner and came out of the trenches, so to speak, of my depression and anxiety, it was this like very clear awareness of it doesn't have to be like this. It shouldn't feel this hard or this difficult. And my journey of struggling so deeply was really long. It lasted about 14 months, which more than a year. And looking back, I knew like this shouldn't be the case. And so it was just the best way I can describe it is almost just like this burning fire inside of me where I needed to do something to change this and to help other people and for people to not have a similar experience to what I had because I knew there had to be a better way.
Okay, and could you share with us also your experience with your pregnancy? How was
Yeah.
it like?
Absolutely. With my son, I have two kids. My first pregnancy was pretty textbook, right? Like, as first-time parents, we read all the books, we attended birth classes, we kind of all the things that a lot of first-time parents do. Um, but never once in any of the classes that we attended was there any mention of anything regarding anything mental health related, or like what truly happens or could happen to you emotionally after having a baby. And so once my son was born, I ended up developing such severe postpartum depression and anxiety. And back then, when it was happening, I had no idea what it was. I had no idea it even had a name. And, I was a new mom, and what I was so flooded with were these feelings of just sadness and confusion and anger, and not really even knowing what was happening. And it was after we were home from the hospital. It's very, like, it might have even been the day we were home from the hospital. Um, I couldn't eat, which is very unlike me because I love to eat. I love food. I couldn't sleep, and my body literally felt like it was on fire. And I was like profusely sweating. My skin was crawling, and I was in so much physical pain. I had a cesarean and, pain from trying to breastfeed. And this is when the panic attacks started on like a daily basis. All of that like triggered those panic attacks. And with the anxiety, like I really struggled with this debilitating, crippling anxiety for months, like not being able to leave the house, having intrusive thoughts, really isolating myself from people. And during this time too, what was happening, and I can think about it now, but I didn't realize it at the time, is how much my identity, like my self identity, was being put through the grinder. Like I simply didn't know who I was. I didn't feel like a mom because I was struggling so much. I didn't feel like the corporate professional that I was because I had no idea like how to connect with people outside of my work environment. And what was really confusing too is that anxiety was really, really high for the first 6 months of his life. But around 6 months, it's like it shifted. That anxiety shifted more into depression, which was really confusing at the time too. Like, how could I feel so anxious? And then now I'm all of a sudden feeling super depressed. And then around 10 months, the depression really shifted more towards like anger and rage. Like I was just mad. And I channeled all of that anger, honestly, like to myself. I was mad at myself and really mad at my partner. And that's really confusing, like to have all these different emotions, because we were at this point well out of that newborn phase, right? Like my son was getting ready to turn 1 year old. And I had no idea that any of this could be related to like giving birth, like the hormonal changes that I was experiencing. And help was really, really difficult to find. I finally got the courage to speak to my OB, my doctor. And as much as I loved her, she just kind of shrugged me off and just said I was tired. I needed more sleep. I couldn't get a therapist to call me back. And in my mind, I had the thought of like, oh, I did what the book told me to do. Like, I guess this is just how it is. And so I just kind of bottled all of that internally and just suffered through it. But it really was, my son turned about 14 months when I could see the light again, so to speak, where I could feel those changes happening, where I felt like I was almost kind of like grounded back on earth again. And that's really when I could have the opportunity to even start to process like what had happened or what I was experiencing. And then that was when I really started to have those feelings of, number one, like being just really angry, right? Like that it was so hard to find help, and that out of all of that time that I spent preparing in my pregnancy to have my son, like never once was any of this discussed. And so that kind of going back to the fuel of like what helped me start life with baby is really that feeling of like, it just simply could not be this way.
Yeah, I can really understand. It sounds really hard to go through everything without knowing and being aware that this can happen. And I'm curious to know, when did you actually realize that it's postpartum depression or anxiety? Like, when did you get those terms in your head?
Yeah, it was honestly like after my son was born and I got through this experience that first year, I honestly thought like I cannot have another child. Like there is no way I can go through this again. And but honestly, deep down in my heart, I wanted two babies, right? And so I knew I would probably regret it if I did not have a second child. And so as terrified as I was, we decided to have a second baby, but we did everything different the second time around. And it was even when I was first pregnant, we put more time and attention into preparing for my mental health, my husband's mental health. Like, how are we going to live with two babies at home, right? More so than like all of those pregnancy books that we read, right? And it was during that time that I really learned about postpartum anxiety and postpartum depression by finally finding a therapist and an OB that would talk to me about this. And so knowing that this existed, that there was even a condition called postpartum depression and anxiety, it was like clear as day, as like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I experienced. And so we were able to really just look at that second pregnancy through a different lens and really think about, okay, what are we going to do if this happens again, right? And so we literally wrote out like the name and the phone numbers of my OB, the therapist, my best friend, and stuck it on our refrigerator in our kitchen, because that way, if I was in a state where I couldn't talk or I was having difficulties, like my mom could call or my husband could call for me. And it's like we kind of had a plan in place of what to do
Mm.
if those emotions came back the second time. And so um, the second time around was a totally different experience. I won't say that it didn't have moments of anxiety and depression, because it absolutely did, but it was incredibly different. The magnitude of which it was so much lower. And knowing what it was and knowing that I knew what to do when things were escalated, it brought it back down so much quicker. And so it was a like day and night difference as far as like the postpartum experiences between my two kids.
And how was it for having, like, experiencing that with your partner, and the second time experiencing it differently with your partner? Probably that made a whole difference with your parenting also.
Absolutely, right? And of course, when you have a second child, you're going into it with wisdom and experience that you just simply don't have the first time, right? So it's always going to be different the second or third or fourth or fifth time around. But it absolutely changed I would say, even like the confidence in myself as a parent, right? And because I knew when my daughter was born that these feelings of anxiety and depression were not my fault. It wasn't because I wasn't doing something correctly, or that I wasn't a good enough mom, or that, I wasn't doing things that other people could do, which was exactly my thought process the first time around. And so just having that confidence in myself and learning to just trust my intuition and like knowing when I needed support made such a difference that second time around too, as well.
Nice. And following back to postpartum anxiety, I wanted to ask because usually everyone now tries to raise awareness about postpartum mental health, and postpartum depression is the focus usually. Would you say that this was even harder because postpartum anxiety is not that focused as a topic when we talk about postpartum mental health?
Absolutely. And you're totally right. Like, I would say there's definitely more awareness with the word postpartum depression, and people are more aware of that, which is good. Awareness is always good in that sense. But yes, I think postpartum anxiety it's just as common and not quite as well known that it exists the way that postpartum depression does, and that you could have both at the same time, which was really confusing too. Like, you think, how can I feel depressed and anxious at the same time? But both can exist like exactly at the same time. And so I think what's so super important to know about both postpartum depression and anxiety, that they're the two most common perinatal mental health disorders, right? Like, the statistic is they affect one in every five birthing people, or about 20% of people that give birth. So it's really, really common. And what's pretty wild too is that, even when you see these statistics, that this is only for like the reported diagnosed cases of depression and anxiety, right? Like, when you think or account for all of those cases that never go diagnosed, or, that are never actually people seek treatment for, that number is probably way higher, right? Which makes it even more common. And another statistic is that, only about 15% of people that are experiencing a perinatal mental health disorder get treatment. So that's really, really low. And that's problematic for, so many reasons, right? And really impacting not only the life of the mother, the birthing person, but also the baby and the family dynamic as well.
Yeah, and having the statistics of 15%, what are your thoughts on why is that? Like, besides the problems that society and our culture has, but like, why women are not diagnosed?
Absolutely. I think there's so many reasons, right? Number one, just overall like lack of trust in providers, or being dismissed by providers. Fear, like whether it's based on religious or cultural or society fears of, there's a common narrative. And I know this from my own personal experience. When I did talk to my OB when I was struggling so much, I was not open and transparent, because I had convinced myself if I truly told her what I was thinking, Child Protective Services would come in and take my baby away. And so I really downplayed what I was feeling just out of fear. And that's all based on stigma and like misconceptions. But there, you also pair that with the providers that's not informed on how to handle these situations, and it can be problematic, right? And so, and then there's also barriers to care as far as like transportation and childcare and cost. And, there's so many cost restrictions for people seeking care, and time, right? Like, how do you find care or somebody that takes your insurance when you have two babies at home and no way to get there and you're trying to work? Like, it can be very, very difficult. And I think as parents too, it's really common where the needs of yourself as a parent really fall very low on the priority list, right? Like, typically people will do so much more to ensure that the baby's taken care of, but really deprioritizing themselves is part of the, I would say, overall larger issue of people, finding support.
Yeah, and this backfires to basically how you parent and how you feel as a parent also.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%.
I wanted to ask you because we know that there are risk factors and people who are trying to be prepared I speak with a lot of people who are like, well, I'm usually having these issues with being depressed, or I have mental health disorders. So I read about it. So I'm trying to be prepared when I have a child that I could have any postpartum mental health issue. Would you say that you had anxiety before and you expected something to happen, like not in that big scale, as you said, you didn't know about the terms, but still.
Oh yes, that's such a good question too. And I think, when you always look back, hindsight, it's always crystal clear, right? Like when I look back on my experience, like I can see, oh my gosh, I had so many risk factors that were part of my life, right? And may have contributed to my postpartum depression and anxiety becoming so severe, right? And I didn't know that at the time too. And when we look at risk factors for developing like a perinatal mental health disorder, there's three types of risk factors, right? The first are like biological risk factors, which is like what you mentioned, having a history of a mental health issue, having like severe PMS symptoms, before you start your menstruation, um, an endocrine disorder like diabetes, thyroid issues, or so forth. And the second risk, like kind of group of risk factors, are those social or like environmental risk factors. So that's like even institutional racism or accessibility to care, or being in a very high stressful situation like moving or changing jobs or going through a divorce, or going and dealing with substance abuse, for example, right? And then the third kind of group of risk factors are psychological risk factors. So this is like if you've experienced a perinatal mental health disorder previously, if you had a very like traumatic labor or birth experience, if you had any sort of like childhood or adult trauma or sexual or physical or emotional abuse or neglect, even like fertility treatments, going through IVF, or experiencing a loss, or having a baby in a NICU is a very traumatic experience. These are all part of those psychological risk factors that can help contribute to developing a mood disorder. And while I say all that too, I think it's also really important to acknowledge that just because you do have one, or in like my case, I had many, like I could probably check the majority of all of those risk factors, it doesn't automatically mean that you're going to develop a mood disorder, right? Like by no, it's not a guarantee. It just is part of the education, like you were talking about, right? Like just knowing that you have these risk factors, what it does is it provides just an opportunity for you to talk to your provider, to your partner, to talk about like the possibilities or what to do in the case of things became worse when once the baby was here. And honestly, sometimes that's half the battle, right? Like knowing that these conditions exist and knowing what the symptoms are, or like what to do in the case of it developing, it can really help eliminate that feeling of being blindsided or caught off guard, or confused, or where you're placing that blame on yourself of doing something wrong, when in the reality of it, all of these risk factors are out of your control, honestly, right? It's like it's not something that you as any one individual is doing right or wrong in that sense.
Yeah, definitely. And also, even if you don't have any risk factors, it is still possible that you could experience something. So that's why raising awareness and staying educated that these things exist is a good thing and is definitely needed. As you're a perfect example of like doesn't know, and you're unaware that this could happen, so this also makes it worse because you feel like you're failing more when you're not actually failing. And following what you've said about your history, etc., would you say that your parents were supportive in that sense? Because I'm just speaking from the idea that when I asked my mom, for instance, she didn't know that this existed. So I would not have definitely, if I haven't thought about mental health and being a psychologist, I probably would never know about postpartum depression.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think a really, really important dynamic when we're talking about mental health for pregnant and postpartum people. Um, because this can be like an extra layer when you think about your own parents or in-laws or like trusted family members, right? Because for example, I did speak to my mom. I did tell her how I was feeling, and I love my mom. Like, we have a good relationship, but she's not helpful when it comes to things that are dealing with any sort of emotions. And what I mean by that is I was trying to explain to her how anxious I was feeling, and she would very much minimize the situation and say, "Oh, I had 4 babies and I never felt this way." Right? Who, in that moment, it's my mom. Like, I'm as raw and vulnerable as I can be. And when she's telling me, and she's doing it out of love, she never means
Yeah.
to hurt me, but it was so unhelpful. And so having her voice in my head saying things like, I had 4 babies and I was fine, or I never get sad, it was really kind of played into that narrative of like, oh my gosh, she did it. And why can't I? She did it 4 times. I'm only trying to do it once and I can't do it. And it really played into that narrative of what I was doing wrong. And so, in hindsight, too, again, like once I was out of it and I could really go back and think about it, one of the most like valuable lessons I learned for myself as a person is there's certain people in my life that are not going to be helpful for my mental health. And even my mother, as much as I love her and I think she's a wonderful person, she is not somebody that can support me emotionally. So I have chosen, and like moving forward in my life, and even to this day, like, I don't share with her those emotional things because she's not helpful to me, and I don't feel supported in her presence in that sense. But that's a very, very confusing and difficult like route to navigate, especially like with people that are as close to you as parents, or maybe even siblings, or even partners, right? um, it happens all the time. We see it every single day. These relationship dynamics.
Yeah, and definitely I would say this is part of growing up and realizing that it's okay not to share everything, or feel that because someone is close to you, because it's a relative or a parent, it's not like he knows you actually that well. That's what I learned growing up, that my mom is not like this idealistic person that I was growing up with. She's a different person, and now we're equal when we
Yeah.
speak to each other. But I think this is a really great point of how we should learn how to filter who we're asking for help from. So thank you for sharing it. And now I want to ask a further question with your now current career as a mental health coach and a doula. What is the most common postpartum mental health issue that people come to you?
Absolutely. I would definitely say the anxiety and the overwhelm. I think I could confidently say is in 100% of the clients that we work with, right? Whether it's that overwhelm when you're first coming home with the baby, or you're transitioning to going back to work, or navigating those relationships with parents or in-laws or partners, it's really tricky. So, we always talk about how mental health is literally tied to every aspect of your life: how you eat, how you sleep, how you show up for work, how you parent, how you communicate. Like, it's tied to everything that we do every single day. And so I would definitely say overwhelm is the one common thread amongst everybody that we support. And so really the focus when that happens is just really distilling down to what's causing that overwhelm, and then really learning and building out one to two, maybe three like different coping skills or tactics to start to implement and do when a person starts to feel that way.
And I'm also quite curious to learn at what point usually, like averagely, your clients come for help. Because I'm always really interested when I talk about mental health issues is to learn also the treatment seeking period of going further the stigma and actually seeking for help. So when do they usually come for help?
Yeah, that is such a great question, too. I would say on average, we're typically getting most clients coming in around that 2 month postpartum mark, right? So, where they're home, they're adjusting to being at home with baby, and, stress and anxiety or depression just continues to go up and up and up. And it's usually around that 2 month mark as well, where baby's going through sleep changes and may be more fussy or be just more like inconsolable, which is very triggering and can really exacerbate feelings of anxiety when you're feeling pretty miserable yourself and you have a baby that's crying nonstop. It is incredibly taxing on like your nervous system on like a physiological level. And so we get a lot of clients around that time. And then we get a lot of clients during the transition when either the birthing parent is going back to work or ending their leave, or the partner is going back to work, where there's some sort of like transition to the dynamic in the home. And surprisingly, one thing that a lot of people are not aware of is, later on when menstruation returns for the birthing parent, or if you stop breastfeeding, for example, your body goes through these significant hormonal changes. Like your hormones really are kind of all over the place. And what can happen for some people, and we see this quite often, is maybe you didn't experience any anxiety or depression, after the baby was born. But let's say menstruation returns around 10 months postpartum, and you go through this big hormonal change. And then at 10 months, you're starting to feel really severe symptoms of anxiety. That catches a lot of people off guard because they're getting close to the baby's first birthday. They're not really thinking about like any sort of perinatal anxiety. And what we always like to tell people too is that these feelings can come up for the first time at 10 months or 12 months, or it might even be 16 months postpartum, right? Like there's no like definitive time that it has to appear. But I would say those are kind of like almost like earmarked phases throughout the postpartum journey where we see a lot of people first coming and looking for support.
Hmm. That's really interesting, and I think this shows again how much is this topic under researched? Because I've never heard, and I think usually medical professionals are not actually sharing these things, even if they know it, because they're not used to talk about mental health. And I am speaking from a really like a Balkan country, so it's quite different. But for people that I speak to, it's everywhere in the world that people are not sharing these issues when the information is there, so they should know it. Being a
Yes.
professionalist.
100%. And, in the States too, like you only see your OB provider at 6 weeks after giving birth, right? That's it. Like you get one checkup. If as long as you're looking okay 6 weeks postpartum, you're dismissed. Like there's nobody looking after you or helping support your health after that 6 week mark. It is 100% on the patient, the parent, to go and seek out that treatment, right? And so that's another big part of the kind of overall issue of when you think of, how often you take your baby into the pediatrician. For you go every month, right? In the newborn phase, you're going more often, but after that, you're going every month. And there's just simply not that amount of care or attention put on the birthing parent to ensure that they are truly taken care of and assessed throughout that year postpartum as well. So that's another big part of, I think, the overall like larger systematic problem.
Definitely. And I wanted to ask you about also giving birth, the process, the delivery. How did you deliver? Was it a C-section or a natural birth?
It was with my son, it was a C-section. So he was breached. And we tried everything, so that means that his head was not down to be able to come through the birth canal. His feet were there, his head was up above. And we tried everything to get him to turn into the proper position to deliver. And he just would not move. Like, knowing my son now and like how stubborn and set in his ways he is, it's like we joke that he was just going to be as stubborn as he wanted to be even in the womb. So I had a scheduled cesarean for my son. And um, even the experience of having a C-section was incredibly traumatic at times. And what I mean by that is, I'm in the operating room, my husband's right next to me, I'm strapped down to the bed, and all of a sudden I have this unbelievable, like, pain in my shoulder. It felt like I had been shot, is the best way I can describe it. It hurt so much. And I thought something's wrong, like something's going wrong with my body. And this is like while like they're getting ready to actually deliver my son. And it turns out, and this was something I did not know that was really, really common with C-sections, is that it's caused, it happens in your shoulder, and it's caused by just an air bubble, like air getting up into your shoulder. And so I didn't know what was happening to my body. I started to like shake and convulse, like so deeply and severe. Like my whole body was shaking and I was in such excruciating pain. And then the anesthesiologist finally came over and said, "Oh no, that's fine." And I think he gave me some medicine, and then it made the shoulder pain subside, right? But like in that moment, right as my son was getting ready to be born, I had no idea. Like, of course, there was even the thoughts in my mind, like, am I dying? Like, right? It's like my body shutting down. Like, I've never felt this level of pain before. And I've never, like, shook so fiercely in my life before. But just knowing that that's a really common thing to happen too, like when you're having a cesarean, would have made all the difference in the world
Yeah.
too. And so, because of that experience and just how much of the physical like recovery I went through healing from the cesarean after he was born, I really, really, with my daughter, wanted to have a vaginal birth or do everything that I could to not have to have a cesarean again. And which was successful. I had a different OB, and she really knew my hopes and my wishes for being able to deliver vaginally. And it was tough. It was, a 27 hours of of labor to work to get my sweet girl delivered. But it was two very different, even birthing experiences, which also very much aligns with like those two very different, like emotional postpartum experiences as
Hmm.
well. So it's a unique opportunity to be able to experience different situations.
Yeah, that's why I was curious because there are people who actually have postpartum post-traumatic stress disorder because of giving birth in a really stressful situation. And with the cesarean, I've had so many women speaking to me, and I've learned for many moms that having an emergency C-section is quite traumatic, and because of the misinformation. Even when you had it, not an emergency, you didn't know about a couple of steps, which made it more traumatic. And when you don't know what you're gonna handle, and doctors are not telling you because they don't think it's important when the mom is actually in surgery.
You're totally right. And this is something that we talk about with clients all the time, that when you think about birth trauma or like birth during the labor experience or however your baby is delivered, often the way that doctors and medical providers view trauma is very different than the patient, the parent, right? And what I
Yeah.
mean by that is, trauma is typically like a life or death situation. Did the doctors have to resuscitate the parent? Did they have to resuscitate the baby, right? Where we all know trauma is defined by the person who experienced it, right? And that's where there's such a disconnect between the level of not only compassion and empathy between providers and patients. Of trauma is defined by the person that experiences it, right? So it doesn't matter if the doctor deems it a life or death situation. It's what that person experienced that is traumatic, and that nobody else can define what that is other than that person. And so there's, unfortunately, in pretty much every birth story that we listen to or experience, there's some level of trauma that is experienced, whether it's from, the medical providers, or the baby going to the NICU, or a medical complication, or something happening that where you're actually fearful of, like the shoulder pain in my body, right? Like where you don't even know what's happening. It is very, very, very common, and a big part of what we help people process, that not only is that trauma valid and how important it is, but when that's not processed, how that can really kind of snowball and affect your parenting and your ability to adapt to having your baby at home when you're kind of stuck in that very traumatic experience.
Yeah, and also this affects if you want to have another child or not.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, Amy. So, lastly, I have another question as our time is coming to an end. I wanted to ask you what advice you would give to a mom that just got her new child and she's experiencing all those panic attacks as you were. What advice would you give her if she were you back then?
Absolutely. I think there's two pieces of advice that I would give for anyone that may be listening to this that's struggling right now. And that is, number one, to know that you're not alone, and to speak up any possible way that you can. Whether it's if you're able to talk to your doctor or a friend or a partner, if you're not able to speak and like verbalize it, even sending a text or an email, or like handwriting a note, right? That you're not feeling yourself and that you want to explore help. Speaking up, it's so hard to do, and it can feel really, really challenging. And my advice is that, parenting is really hard. Like becoming a parent, having a baby is really, really hard, but it doesn't have to feel like suffering. Like you don't have to suffer. Um, and with that too, I think there's two wonderful resources that I want to put out to everybody. The first is, it's called Postpartum Support International, PSI, and it's an online resource where they have wonderful information about mood disorders, and they offer like free like online support groups. They have a helpline, and they're in countries all over the world. So they have volunteers in different countries that you can reach out to, and they'll help connect you to like local resources wherever you may be in the world. So they're a wonderful, wonderful resource. And then also just having a mental health plan, right? So whether it's the Life with Baby workbook, or you use anything, if you even just write down names and phone numbers like I did and stick it on your fridge, just the idea of prioritizing your mental health is literally just as important to taking care of your baby or taking care of yourself when you're pregnant. Really kind of thinking of your mental health connected to your baby as like one linked system, meaning that like when you take care of yourself emotionally, you're also taking care of your baby, you're taking care of your whole family.
Thank you, Amy. That was beautiful. I'll put the links below so everyone can look at it. Thank you so much. It was a really insightful conversation.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks for this work that you're doing. It's incredible.